Hello, my audacious art sluts. It's Allison Moon, and you're listening to the Artgasm Podcast. Today's episode I'm going to devote to one topic. I'm not going to do an interview this episode because, as you might know, I live in Portland, Oregon. And as I hope you know, Portland, Oregon is currently invaded and occupied by an antagonistic force of federal agents that no one really wants here. And it is troubling, it is upsetting, it is maddening, and a lot of Portlanders are fighting back. And it is a moment that I wanted to just kind of point to and discuss, particularly the performance aspect of protest. And I'm going to specifically talk about the Naked Athena issue, but I'm going to just talk about the protests for a moment as well. So I went down to the front last night. I did not stay for the massive amount of gassing that was occurring nightly from the federal agents against the citizens of Oregon. So I did not get to witness the violence, the state-sanctioned and federal-sanctioned violence against citizens of Portland. But I did witness a lot of the drumming and the chanting and the speeches and the rage and the upset and fear and feelings that people are expressing. And I was moved and inspired and impressed by the leadership and compassion that the people who were running the event and also the people who were in the crowd exhibited. And again, my experience was a slice. I encourage you, if you want more information about the protests right now, to watch the live streams that many independent journalists are putting up every night. I would recommend you don't look at Fox News ever, or CNN, or any of the large companies that exist on the East Coast, because they're going to give you a very small slice. Just like if I was trying to tell you the character of the protests because of my experience in the 3 hours I was there last night, you would not get the actual experience. But the live streams do a very good job of demonstrating what's going on the ground. And if you want to see the speeches by many of the leaders of Don't Shoot Portland, Don't Shoot PDX, and many other Black leaders on the ground, you can see them speaking into the microphones and into the megaphones during the rallies every night. And if you want to see a bunch of federal agents shoot a lot of chemical agents at citizens for demonstrating their First Amendment rights, you can also see that. And if you want to see people shooting Roman candles at a giant concrete building, you can also do that. And if you want to see people rattling a giant fence erected around that building, you can do that as well. And it's all right there in the live streams. I have been very frustrated seeing people say, I just don't know what's happening there. And granted, I am if you've been listening to this podcast for a very long time, I'm an advocate of not forming an opinion until you experience as much as you possibly can about that thing. Now, this is usually an opinion I reserve for art. I try not to form opinions about art that I haven't actually seen. But I think it's also valid to say it's very hard to form accurate and authentic opinions about a movement of any kind if you're not actually witnessing it unfiltered. So to the degree that you can, I encourage you to get on Twitter. I know on my Twitter, which is at HeyAllieMoon, ALLIE Moon, you can see that I have a list of a lot of local protest coverage and a lot of local journalists who are live streaming or just reporting on the ground as it happens, and I encourage you to look at that. But what I think is useful about this in terms of a relationship to art is this one piece, this very small piece of the movement that kind of garnered a lot of attention, which is the Naked Athena moment. And a little bit of context. So Naked Athena is a person. It was a name given to a person, a protester, who early on, after the feds arrived, stripped naked and walked the line and then sat on the pavement, spread-eagled, and showed off their genitals to the assembled feds, who then retreated. And it became an interesting moment of attention drawn to the protests. And there are a lot of different ways to evaluate this moment, and I'm going to try and speak through a number of different ways and encourage you to kind of make your own mind up about the situation. So First of all, the big reports, there were some really great photographs that were taken, and those photographs went viral, and people basically started talking about this person that they dubbed Naked Athena, and a lot of opinions started. And some of those opinions were presented as facts, and I think that it's important to at least dissect some of the inaccuracies first. First of all, a lot of the news outlets reported that Naked Athena was doing yoga poses in front of the feds, and that Naked Athena is white. These are both not true. The pose that a lot of people have seen, where it looks like she's in the yoga tree pose, where she's got her arms above her head and her one foot on her toe and 1 foot flat, was actually because, and she reported this on a podcast, the one place where she actually spoke publicly about this, was that she actually got hit in the foot by a munitions and she was injured, and so that's why she was leaning on 1 foot and lifting the other one. It was not a yoga pose, but rather a injury. The second piece is that she is a woman of color, a person of color, not black. And of course, she benefits from white privilege and of course, or light skin privilege at least. And of course, when we looked at these pictures, which were all from behind, a lot of people saw a white woman. The third piece that was going around, and I'm not quite sure I can actually verify it in one direction or the other, was that this person is actually genderqueer and used they, them pronouns. I saw that piece of information going around through unverified sources, basically friends of friends. So I can't speak to the veracity of that. And so I'm going to go with the Willamette Week, which is a newspaper, reported on Naked Athena and used she, her pronouns, and they used the pseudonym that she was using, Jen. So I'm going to just go with that because that is a journalistic space that I respect. And if I'm proven wrong, I will retract, but otherwise I'm using she, her pronouns. But I think, again, these speak to the complications. Now, the added complications that people also wanted to point to is that Jen is the daughter of immigrants and also a sex worker. Now, these pieces are used in some ways as cudgels. They're used some ways to yell at people for having, what people may consider incorrect opinions, right? And so there are multiple schools of thought. I do not want to present this as a binary idea of whether or not you're for or against Naked Athena. I think that this is a complicated thing. It has a lot to do with art. It has a lot to do with performance. It has a lot to do with white privilege. It has a lot to do with the endlessly unfolding complications of uprisings and the focus that gets pulled in multiple directions, and then the way that the mass media is easily manipulated by those things. So this is a very complicated thing. But to speak to the kind of the main arguments, on one side of this, you hear a lot of people saying, if Naked Athena were black, she would not have been treated with the same respect by both the feds and the media. And speaking as a white woman, I cannot say for sure that that is true, but I certainly believe a lot of black women when they say that very thing. I certainly believe that if Naked Athena were not conventionally attractive, at least from behind, a very svelte figure, if Naked Athena were any sort of non-normative shape or color, I think that the media would have treated it very differently. If she were fat, if she were disabled, if she had any sort of body that didn't look like the bodies that we see in our museums, there would be, I'm sure, pushback. And I'm seeing this a little bit even from last night. There was, from live streams, there was a person of indeterminate gender last night who was recorded saying something very amusing about how the munitions weren't effective on them. And I'm not going to get into the details, but basically in the video, what I saw was a trans woman basically just shit-talking the feds in that their tear gas wasn't working on this person. And I thought it was awesome, and I thought it was this moment of like, yeah. And at the same time, that person was basically being consistently degraded and shamed in the comments on that video because that person's gender is unclear to the average onlooker, and thus they are subject to all the degradation and retaliation and hate that the internet has inside of it. So That's a moment that was just an interesting contrast. And then, of course, we see the differences in the ways that femininity is presented. And this goes to the next big symbol of these protests, which is the Wall of Moms. The Wall of Moms is a group of mothers and some people of non binary identity who are comfortable aligning with the identity of mother, who are lining up on the front lines to protect the protesters using their own bodies. And in that, they're using their privilege as mothers, they're using their privilege as women who theoretically might be less likely to be attacked by the feds and the cops. And they're using what is often white privilege because the majority of the moms are white or white passing. And this is relevant to, I think, the overall message behind why Portland is the city that Trump chose to attack. Because Portland is a very white city, and by its very nature, the movement for Black Lives Matter in Portland is going to be white. 76% of Portlanders are white. I think 5% are Black. And this is relevant because what happens when you have a movement to defend and support and honor Black lives that is mostly white people? Well, I think there's a part of it that's good allyship, right? We see white people fighting alongside and in support of Black people, and that is a good thing. We want to see more white people putting their bodies on the line to defend the rights of Black people. That is a good thing. But when the photographs honor and support and signal boost those white bodies, what then? And how does that look then? And I think that this is one of the reasons why Trump invaded Portland. He could have chosen any of the other cities in which there are a bunch of people protesting for Black lives. And he chose Portland. And I think Portland is because it's a symbol. It's a symbol of a very radical city, and he wants to quell that kind of radical sentiment. I think there's strategy behind trying to arrest people on federal charges and disenfranchising them from being able to vote, because if you are convicted of a federal crime, you have lost the right to vote. I think that it is also, Oregon's history is incredibly complicated. We are a state that had codified anti-Blackness in its constitution for far too long. And I mean, any time is far too long, but 100 years after the Civil War, we were still trying to disenfranchise Black people from owning property. For a long time, we did not allow Black people to stay in the state for longer than 3 years. And even though we were ostensibly anti-slavery, we very much did not want Black people to own land here, to live here, to thrive here. And so because of that, Oregon is 76% white and 5% Black, and that is an ongoing issue. So then when you take these pictures of these very visible moments, you're going to see mostly white people. And when the movement is about Black people, is for Black people, what does it look like when you see a bunch of white people putting themselves at the center of the frame? And I think there's a little bit of a difference. There's a lot of differences between Naked Athena and the Wall of Moms. Naked Athena was one person making a spontaneous choice to get naked and present herself to the feds. And on one side, you can see that as a woman using her white privilege and female privilege to create a barrier between the feds and the protesters behind her. And in a lot of ways, she won. She got them, the feds, to retreat on that front. That was a powerful moment. And let's be clear, women flashing their genitals at armies is a very, very old tactic that goes back far, far longer than I think a lot of people appreciate. There's a word for it in Greek called anasryma, where it is a woman lifting her skirt to expose her genitals to create an effect in an onlooker that is not about sexual arousal, but often, at least in the way they used it in Greece, to inspire fear of the enemy. And there is a spiritual component to this notion of being that women's genitals are so powerful as to create an emotional response in men that is not sexual arousal, but based on sorrow or fear or mystery or just powerlessness in the face of this symbol of this body part that gave them life. It's an interesting idea, and I think that whether or not Naked Athena knew that she was partaking in this tradition is questionable, but at the same time, as a sex worker, I think that there is a level of understanding there around the power of women's bodies. I think that female sex workers understand this to a very powerful degree, that their bodies hold a lot of power, and I think they might often know that far better than non-sex workers. And so Naked Athena's choice to display her genitals spread eagle style, I think was very much within this tradition of showing this invading army what they're fighting. And whether or not that's to instill a sense of empathy or not, I don't know. I do think that, and in Jen's own words, she did speak to this on this podcast, saying that the inspiration was to strip naked and show these soldiers who they're actually fighting. And that, again, the vast majority of people showing up to these protests are unarmed. The vast majority of these people who show up to the protests are non-violent. The vast majority of the people who are showing up to these protests are fighting to defend Black lives and fighting to defund the Portland Police Department by 50% and are fighting to force Ted Wheeler to resign after he tear-gassed his own citizens nightly for 50 odd nights. So there is a lot of movement behind this, and I think that Naked Athena did an interesting job of performing and certainly centering herself, and that is very clearly a thing that is a challenging thing to do in, again, a movement that's ostensibly about Black people and Black lives and Black right to live and pursue happiness in any society. So in doing so, she put a spotlight on herself. On the back end, so to speak, she refused to continue that spotlight. She didn't name herself. She didn't do any interviews other than this one local podcast. She's not making it about herself in any way other than this picture became a very powerful symbol that went viral for all of the reasons that I already stated. So there's that. And on the other side, there's the Wall of Moms. And the Wall of Moms are also putting their bodies in between the protesters and the feds. And the Wall of Moms, they are getting injured. The Wall of Moms is mostly white, but certainly led by Black mothers, and the Black mothers have been there since the beginning, and Black mothers have been leading these movements for a very, very long time, because Black mothers are often those who lose the most. In police violence, they're the ones who are losing their children or their husbands, and they have a lot to lose, and they have a lot to fight for, and they are the ones who are putting their bodies on the line. And I find that to be incredibly inspiring. And what's so interesting about the Wall of Moms is that they're using that maternalism, that tenderness as a weapon. They are singing lullabies. They are demonstrating their sweetness. There are, I saw signs last night that said, "Feds, go to your room," and a lot of other fun signs that were kind of mocking this notion that feds are basically being colicky children. They are being little imps. They are being bad, and they need to be punished. And I think that that's a really powerful symbol. And I think that the reason why this is a powerful symbol to, the rest of America is because there is a story that is being told and is being filtered through all of the various media channels that say the people protesting are young punk anarchists, and they're just bad guys with fireworks, and they're just anarchists. And that there are anarchists there, and there are young white punks there, but they are by no means the majority. And ultimately, these moms are very representative of the people you see at protests. They have been there since the beginning, and now they're just organizing. There's now a wall of veterans that we see in between the protesters and the feds. There are a lot of people who are showing up, and they're using their privilege to pull the spotlight onto them so that they can show the world what this protest actually looks like. And in that focus pulling, we get to the central conundrum of this movement, which is this still about Black lives? And having been there, having seen people continually reminding people, witnessing the signs and the chants, 100% it is still about Black lives. However, I think that the media really enjoys seeing things that look a little bit more palatable to the average white American. And so we are seeing the Wall of Moms, we are seeing the lullabies, we are seeing Naked Athena, we are seeing white people being angry. And I think, there's a great example of this with the Navy veteran who got completely pummeled by feds and then had to have pins set into his hands, but ultimately looked very nonplussed in the moment. And it was this kind of badass moment. And he was a white guy, and he's a big white guy, and he was using his privilege to step towards these feds and to basically allow them to pummel him. And it just reminds me of what I heard last night during the speaking portion of the evening, which was the leader whose name I do not know, and I'm happy to add it if anybody knows who it was, but it was a Black man who was asking the crowd to say, "Do you have my back? Do you have my back?" And I thought that was it's a very basic phrase, but I thought it was a very useful phrase to remember that this is about white people supporting Black people. This is about white people being, in some ways, behind Black people. Now, in doing that, in being behind a Black person, you are then putting that Black person between the feds and the white people, and it's just an interesting problematic symbol, this idea that we should be behind instead of in front. So a lot of white people are choosing to put their bodies between Black bodies and fed bodies, and I think that's a really useful thing. All of this, I think, is a very interesting conversation about symbolism of war. Granted, this is not a war yet, but there's a lot of symbolism of war happening. But symbolism of uprising, symbolism of protest. Who gets to be in the center of the frame? Who gets to have the focus on them? Who gets to be looked at? And this is kind of going back to why I said at the beginning, if you want to see what's going on in Portland, look at the live streams. Don't look at the media, because the media is edited. The clips you're going to see on CNN and Fox and MSNBC, they are edited. And they are edited through the filters of the journalists on the ground, and then the managing editors, and then the chief of that segment. They are going to be gone through filters and filters and filters, and I guarantee most of those filters are white, heterosexual men. So if you are looking through at any media item whatsoever, odds are you're going to be looking through that lens. And when you're looking at a movement for Black lives through these filters, you're going to be getting incomplete information. And these streams show you not complete information. You're still getting the information through a camera, but it's as good as you're going to be able to get without actually putting your boots on the ground. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. So please signal boost the live streams, signal boost the people who are actually on the ground, who do not have the agendas that a lot of people do, and continue to listen to Black people who are talking about this movement, because this movement has not died at all. In fact, Trump's cronies have definitely enlivened this movement. When I went to protest, the last time I went to protest was in June, and it was a march, and it was a very beautiful march, and then we ended up occupying a bridge and doing a die-in, and that was really great, and I thought it was lovely. And there was also a certain amount of exhaustion, because this had been going on for at least 30 days at that point. People were tired, like physically tired, and it's the time to be tired. And then Trump sends in his thugs, and all of a sudden, thousands of people are in the street, which speaks to another thing. There were a lot of people who seemed to be okay with cops tear-gassing citizens, as long as those citizens were young, were Black, were male, were anarchist, leftist weirdos. Now that the feds came in, the feds were indiscriminately, and are still currently in this moment, indiscriminately targeting everybody that they don't like. And everybody that they don't like is anybody on the other side of that fence. So they have been attacking press. They have been attacking old people. They have been attacking children. They've been attacking everybody who's on the ideological opposition. And we need to remember that, because there is a movement that Black Lives is a part of, but it has become, I don't want to say bigger, but decentralized in some ways. That is a movement about how inappropriate it is for a despot to send a private army to occupy a city within his own country. And this is where a lot of people are getting ragey. Because again, for a long time, people would be watching at home thinking, whatever, just those anarchists graffitiing the federal building, let them get tear gassed. Now, it's a lot of people upset that our little baby dictator is trying to enact war upon its own citizens. And I think that's fascinating. And I think it's important, and I think it's good. And I think that honestly, if this is the hurdle that we had to cross before people started getting really upset, personally, I'm okay with that. Personally, I don't mind that Republicans and Second Amendment folks and conservatives and states' rights folks, I don't mind that they're getting pissed now. I would have really liked it if they were getting pissed when they watched George Floyd be slowly murdered under the knee of a cop. And I'm upset that they weren't. And I really wish that was enough for them. I really wish that, any black lynching was enough for them. But it wasn't. And now, hopefully, a lot of people are opening their eyes to see what this is all a part of. And what this is all a part of is the continual subjugation of ideological opponents. And for a long time, those opponents looked just like anarchists. Those opponents looked just like black leftist anarchists. And now those ideological opposition proponents look like veterans, and they look like moms, and they look like old people, and they look like disabled people, and they look like trans people, and they look like black sex workers, and they look like a lot of other people. And some of those people look like the people who, for a long time, were supporting Trump and supporting his occupation of Portland, Oregon. I'm hoping that as more eyes are continually on Portland, Oregon, and as will quite soon be on Detroit and Oakland and Atlanta, cities that are certainly not 75% white, I'm very interested in seeing how national response is to this. I think that the question that I'm left with now is, what kind of symbol is considered an effective one in times of protest, in times of uprising? Is palatability a problem? Does palatability change the focus so drastically as to leave the message on the cutting room floor? And I don't know the answers to that. I'm still grappling with that. I am grateful to anybody who puts their body between the feds and the protesters. I am in awe of that. Again, like I said, I left before the tear gas last night. I was not emotionally or physically prepared to put my body on the line like that. And I am going to try to get to that place, but it is fucking scary. And I am in awe of anybody who does that. And I am grateful to everybody who does that. I want to leave you with a link to a piece that I thought was great. And I did a great job distilling this conversation, that the Naked Athena thing. And again, it's titled, "Who Gets to Be Naked Athena?" And it was an op-ed that was in the New York Times on July 25th, which was just a couple days ago, by Mitchell Jackson. And Mitchell Jackson is a Portlander and is black and is speaking quite well to this notion of not only Naked Athena, but weirdness. And Keep Portland Weird is a motto, is a pride point. Keep Portland weird. And what I think Jackson does so well is discussing who gets to be weird, who gets to display themselves in a non-normative way, and what non-normativity even is, and the privilege and the responsibility that goes with weirdness. And I think it's a great piece. I recommend checking it out. Again, it's "Who Gets to Be a Naked Athena" by Mitchell Jackson in the New York Times op-ed. And if it gives you a good sense, brief sense, but a very well-written, concise sense of how Portland got here, how Oregon got here, and why we're at the crosshairs of Trump's agenda. So there's that. Anyway, thank you again for joining me. Please do follow the live streamers on the ground. Please donate to the bail funds in Portland if you can. Follow Don't Shoot PDX and do what you can to encourage people to consider that this movement is far more complex than they might be seeing, and far more interesting and nuanced and honestly terrifying than Fox News wants you to see. And please do your best to have these conversations with people. I know it's really hard. I'm seeing it all the time. I started being on Facebook again as this went around because I was witnessing so much misinformation, and I realized that so many of my friends are not in Portland and they had no idea what was actually happening. So I felt like I needed to jump on and say, here's what's happening. So if you were one of those people, feel free to send them this podcast. Feel free to send them to any sources of people who are actually here, because just you gotta be here, man. You gotta see it for yourself to really understand it. All right, until next time, thank you as always for listening. You can always support me on Patreon, patreon.com/artgasm. You can follow me on Twitter, although I'm going to be taking a Twitter break for my own mental health, and I'm at Hey Allie Moon on Twitter. And again, you can subscribe to this podcast anywhere that podcasts exist, and feel free to spread the word. Thank you as always. Feel free to reach out to me if you have thoughts, feelings, questions. I certainly want to be able to be a beacon of some sort of intelligent conversation in these very, very bizarre times. So to the degree that I can, I'm here for you. All right, until next time. Bye.